Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
I am honored and delighted to welcome you here today to the Symposium Dislocations and Migrations. I'm Natalie Panther, Assistant Director of the Helmerich Center for American Research. And this is Brian Hosmer. I am sure that most of you know that this building is the home of the Gilcrease Library and Archive, a diverse collection of documents that covers the period of Spanish exploration of the Americas. It covers the founding of democracy, and it chronicles in detail the story of Native American relocation and resettlement to Oklahoma and the surrounding areas. We thank you for your continued support of the Center's Advanced Seminar Series and Visiting Scholars Program. This is our 6th symposium, but it's the first one that we have organized with the University of Tulsa's group, Cultures of the Americas. And Brian Hosmer, Professor of History at TU, is here to talk to you more about Cultures of the Americas.
Thanks, Natalie, and welcome, everybody. It's nice to see you joining us for Dislocations and Migrations. We've got 2 days of really exciting and diverse panels that touch upon some really profound issues that are affecting our world today, and we're going to look at them from a variety of disciplinary and chronological perspectives. So it's really an exciting thing. I want to thank Natalie for opening the proceedings and, more importantly, for supporting this symposium, the ideas that drove it, and the faculty and staff group that organized the panels. We identified Dislocations and Migrations as a Cultures of the Americas symposium. So what is Cultures of the Americas? It's a faculty and staff-driven initiative designed to nurture cross-disciplinary research and teaching by focusing primarily on the rich resources housed at the Gilcrease, the archives here at the Helmerich Center for American Research, and McFarland Library Special Collections that are located on the TU campus. So we're looking at this sort of whole body of rich collections. CODA, as we call it, is inspired by the partnership that initially drew together Tulsa's great cultural and educational institutions, TU and the Gilcrease, and the idea that linking museums and archives with faculty and students would enrich us all and draw distinction to our city and to its creative communities. So there was a larger vision in mind. For Culture of the Americas, we can say that collections, people, and ideas drive this initiative. Broad and diverse, our collections have a strong hemispheric orientation, thus Americas, north, south, east, and west, U.S., but not defined by international borders. They include pre-Columbian materials, fine art, documents spanning the depth and breadth of our experiences. That's what we mean by the Americas. Cultures refers to the cross-disciplinary connections that we seek to nurture. Scholars from many, if not all, humanities, arts, and social sciences disciplines are interested in culture, right? However we might think about this and however we might define it. And this complementarity extends to the collections themselves, so that we're looking to pull things together. As we build Cultures of the Americas, we see it as less of a program or an institute with a fixed agenda or a product than a creative and dynamic set of relationships that have, as I said, people and ideas at the core. You might say that CODA is intentionally entrepreneurial, open-ended, and I would argue that it operates, as much as I don't like to apply business terminology to the academy, it operates more like an incubator than a specific program. Really, it's about that. That's the sort of principle. It's an incubator for arts and humanities and social sciences that is driven by rich collections that, through investigation and analysis, help us understand Cultures of the Americas and maybe where we're situated in all of these things. So the symposium reflects this kind of organic, decentralized approach. Rather than a typical top-down process where a symposium planning committee determines themes and scope and participants, we elected to conceive of our panels as interlocking units, interlocking pods, each organized more or less autonomously. Working as a group, we settled on the theme, then simply requested ideas for panels. What we received reflects the richness of our creative communities, the capacity of our people to creatively engage our theme, and the diversity of disciplinary approaches, and I hope you'll see this over the next couple of days. So we talk about cultures of the Americas. To this, we also asked Gilcrease and McFarland staff to draw attention to corners of our collection that speak to panel themes. So we'll see some short videos interspersed with some of these panels, and over lunch, we're going to have a talk by Diana Folsom, who's the Director of Digital Collections. So we're going to kind of return periodically to what we actually have here and think really directly about those things. After lunch, I'm going to take a few moments to recognize the many people who made this possible. But what we want to do now is move right into the panels, less from me, more from the people you came here to see. And so with that, what I want to do is move to our first panel, which is entitled, what is my title again? People, Process, and Politics of Latin American Migration to the United States. And our panel organizer and chair is my colleague in the History Department, Andrew Wood, the Stanley Rutland Professor of American History at the University of Tulsa. So thank you and welcome again.
Thanks, Brian. Good morning, welcome. Happy Good Friday, happy Passover, happy soon April Fool's Day, and at least for some of us TU employees, happy Teachers' Payday. Our panel, as Brian mentions, deals with various aspects of migration from Latin America to the U.S. And I just want to make a few comments before introducing our first panelist, Julie Ward. Latin America recently has been, unfortunately, considered perhaps a forgotten territory, a forgotten continent, as one recent sort of history has put it, and this is unfortunate. Latin America, Spanish America, Luso America, the Caribbean, these are our neighbors. These are the people who live with us in the Americas. They are Americans just as much, dare I say, as a Canadian with a green card. They are just as much Americans as those of us who live in Middle America or wherever. They're not just people who reside in the exotic destinations we happen to visit when going on vacation or perhaps conducting dissertation research, but folks who do the work here, clean the sidewalks, wash the dishes, and much, much, much more. So Latin Americans are with us, among us, and are us as well. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, they're our colleagues, and they are a demographic, some, not all, who, as Jessica Bruder mentioned last night, are a demographic currently in peril. And you'll hear more about this in just a few minutes. I'd like to read a well-known poem from, or at least attributed to, Martin Niemöller, perhaps with some additional flourish from the great playwright Bertolt Brecht. First they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the gypsies, but I disliked them, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the homosexuals, but they bothered me, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the Catholics and the Jews, but I did not like them either, so I did not speak out. When they came for me, there was no one left to speak out. Julianne Ward is soon to be, I presume, an associate professor of Spanish literature and languages at the University of Oklahoma. Her work has appeared in a number of journals, And her book, A Shared Truth, The Theater of Lagartijas Tiradas al Sol, is under contract to be published by the University of Pittsburgh Press. So please join me in welcoming Julie Ward.
Okay. All right, thank you all so much for being here. I'd like to thank the Gilcrease Museum and the Helmrich Center and my alma mater, TU, for organizing this wonderful symposium, and also to Drew for inviting me to participate on this panel. It's fitting, I think, that such a symposium on dislocation and migration would take place here in Oklahoma. As we are reflecting on Latin American migration on this panel, it's important to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Osage Nation, we're in the Muskogee Creek Nation, and these facts remind us that the borders that define our states are very recently formed and are contested, and that we don't have to take them as natural facts. So in this talk, I'll look at how one national border affects another one over 1,000 miles away. My research, as Drew said, focuses on Mexican literature and theater and culture. And Mexico's northern border with the US has been a topic of much interest for many authors and readers for some time. In recent years, however, authors have begun to turn to Mexico's southern border with Guatemala and Honduras. And I find that in these texts, mostly novels and stories, the United States continues to loom large from afar. So, all right. So border studies is a very important subfield within Mexican literary studies, and the term almost exclusively refers to works produced along or portraying Mexico's expansive border with the United States. The conceptualization, however, ignores the southern border with Guatemala, mainly. There's one of the southernmost states, Chiapas, is in black, and then in gray are the territories that are not Mexico. And only recently have literary scholars focused on literary production from the South, with the bulk of attention being directed toward production from Mexico City, the capital, and the northern border. And even when we use the term literatura de la frontera, which is considered a genre, border literature, it means the northern border, as cultural production from the capital has been historically privileged. The southern border, then, is the margin of the margin. And only very recently have critics begun to turn their attention to this region. So in this paper, I try to tease out the echoes of the northern border that resound through recent narrative fiction about the southern border, demonstrating that the space of one is indefinable without the other. All right, and here's a picture of a border crossing from Guatemala into Mexico. So I'd like to propose that contemporary Mexican literature focusing on the southern frontier demonstrates the expansion of the US-Mexico border zone to include all of Mexico, displacing many of the negative effects of border policing and undocumented migration to the southern border. Contemporary Mexican authors have in recent years turned their attention to what some have called Mexico's forgotten border. Speaking of forgetting. So I'll look at three authors. Nadia Villafuerte, her book Barcos in Houston, or Ships in Houston, from 2005, is a collection of short stories that revolve around the city of Tapachula, Chiapas, and portray the relationships between locals and migrants. So local Mexicans and migrants from Central America. And then the second text, Emiliano Monge's Las Tierras Arrasadas, which could be called The Scorched Earth, from 2015, adapts Dante's Inferno to narrate the hellacious conditions of trafficked Central American migrants passing into and through Mexico. And finally, Antonio Ortuño's La Fila India, or Indian File, like a single file, 2016, portrays official responses to and participation in violence against Central American migrants in Mexico. Monge, Ortuño, and Villafuerte, the three authors, provide a perspective on migration that has long been ignored in both US and Mexican letters, that of the South-South border. In this presentation, I argue that although border studies traditionally focuses on the US-Mexican border, an analysis of literature focusing on the Mexico-Guatemalan frontier reveals its status as a proxy border for the US. On January 25th, 2017, on the 5th day of his term, the U.S. President signed an executive order entitled Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Improvements. Among the so-called improvements are, quote, the immediate construction of a physical wall on the southern border, that's the U.S. southern border, the detention of individuals apprehended on suspicion of violating federal or state law, including federal immigration law, expedited determinations of apprehended individuals' claims of eligibility to remain in the United States, the prompt removal of those individuals whose legal claims to remain in the U.S. have been lawfully rejected, and the enactment of federal-state partnerships to enforce federal immigration priorities. The priority placed on policing the U.S.-Mexico border is, according to the President, due to, quote, the significant strain on federal resources and overwhelmed agencies charged with border security and immigration enforcement, as well as the local communities into which many of the aliens are placed. Among those who illegally enter are those who seek to harm Americans through acts of terror or criminal conduct. Continued illegal immigration presents a clear and present danger to the interests of the United States, end of quote. And I think we'll see through the text that I analyze that the terror is often displaced. It's not here. So while this controversial wall, which already exists, here's one photo of it, has yet to be expanded under Trump, both the US and Mexican governments have already been working to stem immigration from Central America through public information campaigns and increased detention center capacities on the part of the US and Mexico's Programa Frontera Sur, Southern Border Program, which involves increased immigration enforcement and higher apprehension rates at Mexico's southern border. Given these facts, media attention and literature scholarship continues to focus on the US-Mexico border, further marginalizing Mexico's southern frontier. So this increased policing is pushed further south and also not really talked about. So here I'd like to ask what the cultural products of the border, the stories of the migrating people, might tell us about the varied intentions, motivations, and interests of those who seek to cross borders. Right. So the first author, Nadia Villafuerte, here's a picture of her. Her book, Barcos in Houston, was published in 2005. She was born in Chiapas in 1978, and this work was a result of a national grant for young authors. And it focuses on a variety of stories of pain and hope taking place on the Mexico-Guatemala border. The stories are populated by sex workers, trafficked children, politicians' daughters, people suffering from addiction, gang members, undocumented migrants, and police officers, and they provide a very stark version of the border zone. Through a variety of narrative perspectives, the stories demonstrate the constant influence of racism in society, the dehumanization inherent to the migration processes described, and the persistent presence of the United States at Mexico's southern border, whether symbolic, economic, or political. In one story in particular that I'll talk about today, it's called Turn Around, or Darse la Media Vuelta. The protagonist, Sylvia, has attempted to enter the United States various times. She once made it as far as Nogales when she was a child on the border of the Mexican state of Sonora and Arizona in the US, but she was reported and sent back home when she refused the sexual advances of a man in a bar. So in this story, which is a new attempt to cross the southern border of Mexico, she's ready to begin again and makes a deal with a truck driver named Emilio, who's going to drive her across into Mexico from Guatemala. And she's thinking about the first trip and what it cost her, and remembers saying no was enough for them to deport her. So the idea of setting her own limits, her own borders, is punishable by deportation. And therefore on this trip, there are no limits. The protagonist exchanges sex for a ride with Emilio and steals his wallet before leaving him. She's become merchandise. She has to ride in the back, cargo for him to transport across the border. The main character puts aside ethics on the southern border, mainly due to her first experience on the northern border. She learned there that refusal to offer up her body as payment for passage would only get her sent home. So now she exchanges sex for passage as a matter of course. The moral crisis of the story, when she steals the driver's wallet, shows the complete degradation of ethics on this border. She has absorbed the faceless cruelty of border policing and trafficking, and now her only concern is whether she'll be caught. So even though Villafuerte's stories, this is just one of many, take place on Mexico's southern border with Guatemala, the latent and persistent presence of the US pushes readers to read this border with its violence, racism, and misogyny as a reflection or extension of the northern border with the US. And then the second example is Emiliano Monge. Here he is a photo of the author. His 2015 novel, Las Tierras Arrasadas, adapts Dante's Inferno to tell the stories of trafficking of Central American migrants into and through Mexico. The critic Ricardo Baixeras calls the novel a tragedy of colossal dimensions, citing the direct quotations from the Divine Comedy that sprinkle throughout the novel. Another critic notes that the juxtaposition of the Inferno quotes with testimony from real Central American migrants renders the two different sources, both the Inferno and the testimonies, indiscernible in their lyrical potency and the almost totalizing dimension of its elegiac force, end of quote. So this novel chronicles the journey of two members of a trafficking cartel. They have fatal names, Epitafio or Epitaph, and Estela, which is like a tombstone, and the unnamed, undistinguished masses of migrants who suffer at their hands. And a note at the end of the novel reveals that, quote, all of the italics that appear in this novel belong to the Divine Comedy, or are quotes taken from diverse testimonies of Central American migrants passing through Mexico in search of the United States of America, end of quote. The novel makes passages from the epic poem and the narration of the trauma of migration equivalent by treating them the same formally. However, narratively, the passages take on different roles. The quotations from the Inferno are part of the narration, seamlessly included, and only signaled by the form of the italics. But the quotations from the migrants are obvious, given their use of contemporary slang, and are offset block quotes. So I'll just give you a quick example. This is in Spanish. I can read my translation. The first burst of fire explodes then, and those that have been walking for various days fall to the ground, vomiting those cruel words. That was the first time they used their weapons. Those that were still standing got down, pushing, scooting to one side, as though they wanted to be underneath. No one wanted to be the one who was on top. So in the passage, you can see that Dante's words, which are que sus bocas lanzan crudas, give way directly to the words of an unnamed migrant, fusing together the Christian myth of hell and the real-life experiences of the migrants going through the hell of modern-day Mexico. And the fact that Monge explicitly states that the migrants are only passing through in busca de, in search of the United States, demonstrates the clear connection between this hell on earth at the southern border and the sought-after northern border. And finally, Antonio Ortuño, this is our third author, La Fila India, the most recent novel as well, 2016, portrays official responses to and participation in violence against migrants in Mexico. So we have a protagonist called La Negra, and she works for the National Commission on Migration, and she's sent to Santa Rita, a small town in the south of Mexico, to investigate the fiery massacre. So again, you have this hell imagery with fire, of 40 migrants housed in an official shelter. She's accompanied by her 7-year-old daughter, whose scheduled trip to Disneyland with her father must be canceled in order to make this trip instead. Upon discovering that one of her colleagues at the CONAMI, the National Commission on Migration, is working with the cartel, and that she and her daughter are in mortal danger, along with a survivor of the attack and a journalist, La Negra, the protagonist, uses the visas and the plane tickets intended for the Disneyland trip to escape to the United States. The novel's made up of first and third person narration focused on various characters and interspersed with official communiques by the CONAMI, which are very depressing in their uniformity and repetition. Through the persistent invocation of this unrealized trip to Disneyland, in contrast to the journey that the migrants under La Negra's care are making, the United States functions as an ironic, absurd, and unfulfilled vision of paradise that hangs over the action of the novel. It opens with a chapter that only has 2 lines of dialogue, and the speakers are unidentified, and basically it says, "Is your trip for pleasure? No." So we can assume this is her coming into the United States. And then the novel ends with La Negra and her daughter in Vermont, petitioning for refugee status from what she calls the various simultaneous massacres that we call Mexico. She admits that they had not visited Disneyland, but this idyllic setting in the final scene with hamburgers and park benches recalls all the amusement park qualities of stereotypical life in the US. Though through the metonymic association of tourists and refugees, the novel shows the heavy influence of the paradisiacal imagery of the United States on the hellacious situation at Mexico's southern border. in La Fila India, the United States actually makes an appearance, which is not the case in the other two novels, or works, and is explicitly linked to the artificial happiest place on earth, Disneyland, in contrast to the graphic scenes of death by fire portrayed as taking place in southern Mexico. These extreme references to heaven and hell, while maybe a little overwrought, send a clear message about the relationship between Mexico's northern and southern borders. The novel holds up a critical mirror to Mexican society, particularly in narrations by La Negra's ex-husband, the father of the little girl, who cruelly kidnaps and rapes a Central American migrant woman, keeping her imprisoned in his Mexico City home, before she escapes and, rather implausibly, intersects with La Negra and her daughter in Vermont in the final scene. This relationship implies that Mexico profits from serving as the United States buffer zone and either turning a blind eye or actively participating in the abuse of migrants through the nation's territory. So short stories like those in Nadia Villafuerte's Barcos in Houston reveal the persistent presence of the U.S. in the imaginary of Central American migrants on that border. Antonio Ortuño's La Fila India, the third example, demonstrates the stark contrast between Disneyland and the realities of Mexico. And Emiliano Monge's Las Tierras Arrasadas proposes a cyclical commodification of migrant bodies at the service of international capitalism through his adaptation of Dante's Inferno. A focus on the cultural products of border zones allows for a deeper understanding of the human stories and real effects that policy and policing have on the lives of millions of people, and can contribute to a more humane proposal for safer borders for those on both sides of walls, whether they're real or imaginary. In contrast to a long century of celebrated nationalist narratives in Mexico, these 21st century Mexican authors offer a stark, critical perspective of Mexico's other spaces. Fiction that portrays processes of migration, human trafficking, and border policing portrays Mexican territory as an expanded border between North and South, a space of transit and discipline. Thank you.
Joe, could you help us transition here? Thank you. This is Symposium. Thank you, Julie. We hope to have time for questions before the break. So without further ado, let me introduce my good friend and colleague, Linda Allegro. Dr. Allegro earned her degree from the New School of Social Research and is an independent scholar and activist, as you will hear. She has published widely, including a book that she and I co-edited titled Latin American Migrations to the U.S. Heartland, published by the University of Illinois Press. So please welcome Linda Allegro.
Good morning. Thank you, Drew, for the introduction. Thank you, Julie, for setting a context for me to jump in. I just wanted to open by saying I'm the project director of the New Sanctuary Network, and I'm going to be presenting today as an activist. And what I want to do is to highlight what is happening in terms of immigration enforcement in Tulsa, and to talk a little bit about the resistance and the work that activists, including people like Rosa Hernandez, who, I just want to call her out because I just am such an admirer of Rosa's work, but some of the work that, local activists are doing to try to melt ice. So one of the things I wanted to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about by saying that we're witnessing the very rapid deterioration of human rights and civil rights in our country and in our city. And I will be emotional throughout this presentation, and I'm not apologizing for it because I think that so much of the work that I do and so much of what I want to share with you comes from having developed very deep relationships with people. It's not just some type of, in-depth interviews. They're relationships that we build with people. And we hear firsthand, and we are part of the, wanting to try to exercise, as Rabbi Fitzerman says, whatever privileges we have to try to bring to light, expose, shed light on, lift up the voices of individuals who really can't. And these are people who, and this comes from some of the relationships that I'm building with 8 particular families, have experienced deep trauma, soul-crushing hopelessness, and impoverishment because a loved one has been arrested, detained at David L. Moss Criminal Justice Center right here, and is being deported, and has been deported. So in my short presentation, what I want to do is to talk a little bit about the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office role with ICE, because a lot of people don't realize that we have an ICE facility in our city, okay? I mean, a lot of in the news, what they're talking about is the raids on sanctuary cities, because essentially sanctuary, there's, according to, the new mandate right now is that there should be no sanctuary jurisdictions, and so there is this kind of really aggressive attack on targeting sanctuary spaces, whereas in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, there's a much more systemic and methodical way in which individuals are rounded up, processed for removal and in deportation. So let me begin. A few weeks ago, a group of immigration advocates and activists met with some ICE officials who came up from the Dallas field office. And the public relations spokesperson very calmly and very matter-of-factly told us that the pond is open. The pond is open. What that means, of course, is that in ponds we have small fish, and that it's completely, well within the policy of today to fish the small fish, to go after the small fish. And I just wanted to set that up because, I think that, when you look at the Obama legacy, and if we look at, there are a lot of claims, and of course, and I think they're very truthful claims, that Obama was the deporter-in-chief. There were over 3 million deportations under Obama. And I think that we're still trying to assess and understand the Obama legacy and trying to understand how that kind of set a precedent for where we are today. One of the things in particular I think that is worth looking at in analyzing the Obama legacy, which of course was inherited from the Bush legacy, which is where ICE was, when ICE was created, is this kind of framing of the good immigrant, bad immigrant. That this kind of positioning of, good immigrant, bad immigrant tropes created kind of like this normalization that we had come to understand that, yeah, okay, good immigrants, DACA recipients, they do everything they're supposed to do. They don't have a criminal record, they're there, they're hardworking and they're studious. Bad immigrant, used false Social Security cards, have some type of, encounter multiple entries into the country. Bad immigrant, But the problem is, and I think that this is where it became really what we are understanding is, it was very short-sighted because, of course, many immigrant homes are mixed status homes. So while there is the good immigrant, there's also the bad immigrant mother who did use the false Social Security card to get her daughter where she is today. So I think that we are still trying to understand and trying to work through this kind of, these dichotomies that we've been fed, and that there is some type that we should somehow excuse or accept the good immigrant and the bad immigrant, but I'm inviting you to kind of be more critical in that analysis and see how it, in the end of the day, criminalizes all immigrants. Nevertheless, despite that inherited feature of these kind of tropes, there are some categorical shifts that have taken place with the new administration under This Pond is Open that I wanted to highlight. One of them in particular is this notion of prosecutorial discretion. In other words, in 2011, the then ICE director, John Morton, issued a series of memoranda. They're known as the Morton Memos, and in which they argued that the way that ICE would conduct operations would be very discretionary on particular cases. In other words, that it would make exceptions for pregnant women in detention. It would try to consider issues, first offenses, including first, DUI first offenses. In other words, there was some kind of layering of prosecutorial discretion at every point of encounter with ICE, whether it's from the initial arrest to dealing with the courts, to dealing with immigration judges, to exercise some type of discretion. What we know is that is gone, that's out. There has been very clearly a flattening of prosecution in which, of course, the little fish are equal to the big fish, and we have subsequently seen kind of this kind of doing away with prioritization of removal. Another feature that is very different under the new administration, distinguishing it from the Obama years, is this notion that there used to be this idea that there would be respected sensitive locations, that churches, schools, hospitals, funerals, protests, these were places where ICE would respect the fact that these are sanctuary jurisdictions or areas that they would not tread upon. Again, that has clearly been revoked. We have seen actually arrests in each one of those scenarios. We have seen arrests in hospitals, in schools, at funerals. And while we haven't seen yet ICE entering a church, we do know that sanctuary leaders, including the new, Ravi Ragbir, and some of you might be familiar with Ravi Ragbir, who's, of course, a big sanctuary activist in New York City, of course, was arrested and placed in deportation proceedings. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that things have been bad for a long time. They just got categorically worse. And so, having said that, how can we fight back? What are we doing locally? How can we resist deportation? How can we raise our voices? And I realize I haven't been pushing I just had a few slides, not many, and I don't know what's happening here. Am I pushing the wrong button? Drew, I might need some help. I don't know.
Click that one back on.
That one, and it was just, okay, we're gonna go this way.
Right arrow.
Okay.
There you go.
So, that was just to set up, and this is our lovely sheriff, who actually, by the way, is Latino, who is, of course, Vic Regalado, and Regalado, if you speak any Spanish, means the gifted one. And he actually tells the story that he actually had undocumented parents, and so this is kind of layers of irony, etc. But what can we do to resist, and what are we doing locally, and how might you actually get involved? And I invite you that at 12 o'clock today we will be protesting, as we do every week, in front of David L. Moss. But one thing that we can do is we can publicly protest. What this essentially means is that, we can, stand in front of the jail with the loud bullhorn and call attention, read the names of the most recent detainees, observe, watch, be present, and signal that we are listening, that we are paying attention, that we are observing. I wanted to read, it's a beautiful passage that we read, and we read a script at our protests every week, and we've had 48 consecutive protests, weekly protests. We plan to continue to do that. But one of the things that we'll say, for example, is that we call on our government to release the imprisoned and to enact meaningful laws that provide a path to dignity. We denounce the violence of deportation, and the impulse to send our fellow Tulsans into the void. We will return to this place with every seizure, every hostile assault against a person without documents. Here are the names of our brothers and sisters who've been swept into the machinery of deportation, and then we read the most recent names. And then, we are intended to be a place of refuge, and action by action, we are becoming a prison. What does the still small voice require? But that we act with justice, that we embody mercy, that we walk with humility through a troubled world. Forgive those agents who act with cruelty, but let them look to their hearts and reconsider their course. No one is required to act as a persecutor. So one thing that we do is we publicly protest, and I know that there's been some rolling of the eyes of people who say, well, what are you really accomplishing with that? But we feel that these are stark times, and we need to show up, and we will show up every week in and week out, trying to raise our voice. Another thing that we can do, and this is another strategy of the New Sanctuary Network, and this is kind of in line with what other sanctuary groups around the country are doing, is that we engage in accompaniment. Accompaniment is when, is what we are hearing from the community, and of course they're guiding and telling us exactly what they need, is that people are scared to death to get on the highway, to go to their immigration check-in to Dallas, to go and to immigration court at the immigration office in Dallas or in Oklahoma City. So, and I think this is very important to mention because it is in these public spaces where individuals are arrested, okay? And I think that this is very important to say. They're being arrested on the way to work. They're being arrested on the way from work after the late night shift at McDonald's on their way home. They're being arrested on their day off, okay, at the public park when they had a drink, okay? They are being targeted in public spaces. And I say that very clearly because it's almost like, to me, what that's signaling to me is like, we're okay with your labor, get your labor done, complete building the BOK and the highways, but you're very disposable in the public space, and so that's why we show up in the public space. And the accompaniment program is one in which we physically drive people down to their check-ins. We stand in court with them, and we try to show our deep solidarity as well as try to literally prevent a deportation by, preventing arrest for traffic infractions, which we know is the leading cause of arrests of undocumented immigrants today. And then finally, a third strategy for the sanctuary movement is to offer physical sanctuary. And this is something where, so there are about 800 churches today throughout the United States who have opened their doors to sanctuary. What that means is that they are willing to house undocumented and persecuted people who are facing an imminent threat of deportation and allowing them to live at the church. It's like they're offering physical refuge. There are approximately 40 people in sanctuary, and that's not a great number because it's actually very complicated for every party involved to actually take refuge in a church. Churches are just not equipped to have people live there full time. You have to have showers and kitchens and laundry, etc. But nevertheless, it's a very important and bold gesture on the part of progressive churches, and I'm very proud of them, just in the same way that we see the right-wing churches have mobilized plenty politically, and it's a way to also fight back by saying, well, not here. You're not coming in here. So in conclusion, and as I start to wrap up, and I went back to do the same thing. Here's our accompaniment program, and very proud in the second image there that we actually were able to get Marcela released, who had been detained for over 8 weeks at Moss. And what I wanted to say, just by way of conclusion, is that of course the issues are structural. Of course the problems are systemic. It is about the prison industrial complex. It is about the deportation, the detention deportation pipeline. It is about getting involved in local races. One of the things that we're campaigning on right now, we're working on, is trying to flip the county commission seats, because the county commissioners actually are the ones that have the authority to terminate 287G, just like that. We are getting involved in, hashtag defund hate, hashtag melt ice, hashtag not one more. And I'm very excited to see that there's just been like all this literature that just really of late has come out. I mean, people like Chelsea Manning, who is of course from Oklahoma, who is very boldly going right to the issue in terms of saying, you know what, it's about dismantling ICE. It's about defunding ICE. It's not about reform anymore. It is about, in the same way that we can talk about there's these defunding of, defund Planned Parenthood or, dismantle the IRS. Well, dismantle ICE, and I think that we have to be a lot bolder in our proposals for what exactly that we're asking for. And I end with the parable about, in other words, in addition to the structural changes that we need to see happen, we also need to continue to work on building those individual relationships. Let me end with the parable about fish, because I started talking about fish, and I wanted to end with the parable about fish. I think it's, it's Good Friday, and I'm sure you can see all the symbolism that I'm coming at here. So a grandfather and a grandson were walking on the beach, and this big tidal wave came, and it washed all these starfish onto this coast, onto the shore. And the little boy kneeled down, and he picked up a starfish, and he threw it into the ocean. And then he ran and he picked up another starfish, and he threw it into the ocean. And this grandfather said, "You're wasting their time. There's so many of them. There's just too many." And the little boy picked up another starfish, he threw it into the ocean, and he said, "I got that one." Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Joe. Next is Denni. That's hard when you're education. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Great. Next up, Denni Blum, also a good friend and neighbor. Denni is Associate Professor of Education at Oklahoma State University, and among other publications, she is author of a book, Cuban Youth and Revolutionary Values, Educating the New Socialist Citizen, University of Texas Press. Welcome, Denni, please.
Welcome. Thank you, Drew, for inviting me to be on this exciting panel. It's going to be hard to follow Linda Allegro. But I also really appreciate that we have a symposium such as this to educate one another and to think about things more deeply than what we're seeing in the news. My background is I used to be a high school Spanish teacher, and I lived in Mexico, and I've had a lot of interactions with the Hispanic community. And as Linda talked about, relationships are what bring me here today. And so I'm going to focus on the school and education. And when we look at this, truly it is a system, and the system is multi-layered in several different levels. We have the industrial complex, we have economic issues, the political issues, social issues. All of these are barriers that our immigrants have to confront when they come here, and also in their homeland. Nobody wants to leave their home country. It's because there's something going on there that's unsafe. And what are we doing? Do we not care about our neighbors that are in unsafe conditions? What does undocumented mean? I'm here to educate. I don't know that everybody has the same base for this, but according to our federal authorities, it's one who lacks legal status, overstayed a visa, entered the border undetected. Of the 326 million people in the U.S., approximately 11 million are undocumented, and of those, 5.9 are U.S. citizen children. They were born here in the U.S., living with an undocumented family member. And this is, makes their lives so complicated, as Linda mentioned, being in a mixed status family. The top 3 countries of birth, Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador, these are statistics from 2014. And the reasons to immigrate, again, escaping poverty, of course, seeking a better life, but there's a lot of violence in these other countries. And the violence could be, just gangs, drug cartels, domestic violence, sex trafficking. I mean, the list goes on. And do we want anybody to suffer in those conditions? Sometimes to reunite with families that have been separated. And of course, studying in the U.S. when the education system in their own country is unsatisfactory. What's a very key law is the Plyler versus Doe, the court case, Plyler versus Doe. And this happened in 1982 when the Supreme Court struck down a Texas statute that denied funding for the public education of children who had not been legally admitted to the U.S. And the court voided a municipal school district attempting to charge these students tuition to compensate for the loss of funding. The justices ruled that the Texas law violated the equal protection provision of the 14th Amendment. So we cannot constitutionally deny our students a free public education, K through 12, on account of their immigration status. They cannot be excluded based on their immigration status in schools and school districts. And the schools cannot require information disclosing immigration status, for example, social security number. So not everybody knows that. You can register as an undocumented parent, you can register, or even if your child's undocumented, you can register your student in the public school and they cannot ask you about your immigration status. The unfortunate thing is that this does not include any education but beyond K through 12. And so this puts young people who have been here in this limbo of not being able to continue with their studies in the same manner. As Linda mentioned, schools have been designated as a sensitive location, meaning that would be a refuge for our children, but that is quickly being whittled away. And ICE is possibly in some schools, who knows, at a random time. Another important policy is the U.S. Code 1621, and this prohibits the state or local public benefits to, quote, illegal aliens. So those public benefits include, health, disability, public assistance, and post-secondary education, as I just mentioned, food assistance, unemployment benefit. So this puts our immigrants on edge, and again, as she talked about, dealing with trauma as well. So if you're not familiar with DACA, it just shows you on the left side, you see it does not give amnesty, it does not give a pathway decision or legal status or a green card, but it allows our young people to stay in the U.S. Without being deported, but they have to renew their status every 2 years. They can apply for work, legal presence, and ability to apply for a driver's license, professional license. But again, this is a very delicate situation for those who are DACA youth, and we were supposed to have a decision from our president on March 5th, and we have nothing. And so these young people are really in a state of fear. They're on a precipice, not knowing what's going to happen next. And again, when people are deported, we need to consider what will they be going back to, especially if they have no recall of their homeland. I came over here as young people. And so this just shows you the ways that what's necessary to qualify for DACA. It shows you an extreme vetting process. So again, I think we're privileged to have the DACA people that we do have in our society contributing to our society. The psychological impact, the immigration enforcement makes children collateral damage. There is Luis Zayas from University of Texas in Austin has done a lot of work on this. The Forgotten Citizens is his key book, but he talks about 3 stages of trauma: the before migration, again, if we're talking about a situation of violence, that they're coming from, that they've witnessed of somebody being hurt or killed, the migration itself, talking about the extreme conditions that one goes through in order to reach the U.S., not to mention things that Julie has brought up, that can happen with the abuse. And then they talk about the third is hielo or hieleras are the holding tanks that they will come to when they're detained as they cross the border. Again, severe conditions. Some of the things that Zayas talks about is that you can see in children this hypervigilance as mom goes to the grocery store, and if she's not back in the amount of time that a child thinks that it would take for her to come back, the extreme anxiety that results from simple things out of this fear, the anxiousness, and of course depression. This can affect a child's educational performance, their development, and how children achieve, if they're able to achieve, and the neurobiology of a child. So just this type of trauma actually wires a child in a certain way, especially at a young age, because children's minds cognitively are not fully developed until they're 23. And so when these things are happening to children at such a young age, it will be even more difficult to, quote, rewire them with therapy, which is not even available to them as they grow older. The Urban Institute found that children of detained and deported parents their health deteriorates, they perform poorly at school, again, depressed, and there was a raid in Postville, Iowa in 2008, and they found that distress can manifest itself physiologically in unborn children, so that they saw that children that were born 3 months after that raid had 24% higher incidence of developmental problems. So the challenges they face at school: to be an exile is to lose a sense of place and belonging. So the family separation, being in fear in a mixed status family, intermittent school attendance, the loss of home language also leads to a breakdown in the relationship between the child and the parents. And then this issues of attachment, because the security has been breached. And so oftentimes you see a behavior of withdrawal. So the citizen child who has been born in the U.S. does not give the undocumented parents any legal rights. And so this also produces a separation between both child and parent. So in the U.S., instead of looking out for the best interest of the child, which is usually the situation in all DHS cases, in this situation, if the parent is sent back, they must prove that the deportation will cause exceptional, extreme, unusual hardship, which it's just common sense that this is not in the best interest of the child. So looking at ways to support our immigrant students, of course, in our schools, English, those whose first language is not English, the policy has been that they are to learn English within a year, and usually there are setbacks, and this is a problem policy-wise in our education system. There are so much that they are trying to negotiate at this time that just being relaxed enough to learn the language on top of all of it in 1 year is a lot to ask, especially when in your home that's not the language that's spoken. We need to help students to acculturate, not assimilate to their new lives. And looking at the situation of attachment, this is an emotional need for safety, but there's also another layer, which is belongingness. And we need to have an ethos of reception, welcoming in our schools. So there's, Blaba talks about a territorial belonging, a connection to the broader social and physical world, and not just to one person. So that is a call for our society to remove our stereotypes and try to embrace humanity. And the relationships among school climate, we talk about, that's about relationships, as well as the spaces within the school and the discourse, the language. How do we refer to our immigrant children in the school? And I think that most times teachers need to really reflect, take a critical reflection and see, are we using a deficit discourse or an asset discourse? What are they bringing to our classroom instead of the focus on the language, always? And get, of course, students involved in extracurricular activities, high and clear expectations, and culturally responsive practices, trying to reduce the barrier between home and school, and have those relationships with the parents when possible, looking at our biases, and influence policy that will support immigrants. Dispelling these myths, the misguided explanation that language is the primary impediment to academic achievement overlooks the much more powerful role of poverty. 62% of Latinos live in poverty, and less than 20% of households have a member who has a college education of some sort. Students who are fluent in another language and culture can build bridges in a fundamentally interconnected world. And teachers can ensure that being labeled an English language learner does not limit a student access to all the courses and opportunities that English speakers enjoy. Foster resilient behavior among Latino youth, whose culture has capital. So Tara Yosa talks about 6 capitals that we need to consider for our children. One is aspirational. Do they have that capital to dream, to have goals and ideas for their future? Do they have linguistic capital, communicating in more than one language? Or familial capital, cultural knowledge nurtured within family? Social, as in networks. Navigational, are they able to maneuver through social institutions? And finally, a capital of resistance, one that gives them knowledge and skills for self-esteem and leadership in their community. And that's all.
Switch back to, yeah, just back to, this one, Symposium, yeah, just the front slide, very first slide. I'm a part-time yoga and spin instructor, and so I encourage you to take a deep breath here as we turn and hear commentary from our colleague Misha Klein. Misha is an associate professor of anthropology, yay, at the University of Oklahoma. Her book is titled Kosher Feijoada and Other Paradoxes of Jewish Life in Sao Paulo. Please welcome Misha Klein.
Thank you, Drew. Can you all hear me? Let's see. So I want to thank you for organizing this panel and for the opportunity to have a conversation about these important issues in an interdisciplinary context, but also one, here we are in this palace to human creativity, this celebration of arts and the humanities, and how important it is that we insist on maintaining and creating spaces that value humans in all of these discussions. And this is one of the many threads I want to address as I try to pull together a few thoughts that I have in response to these papers and leave time for all of you to ask questions. But in addition to this panel being interdisciplinary, of course, it also is one that emphasizes the importance of praxis, that mix of theory and action, of ideas and engagement. So our panel, the title, and I think this is all Drew's doing, yes, the title of the panel is one that is alliterative and brings together people, processes, and politics in thinking about these issues of migrations from Latin America to the United States. So I want to revisit the 3 Ps, people, processes, and politics. Again, thinking about people in terms of keeping our emphasis on people, on their humanity, because so many of the processes are dehumanizing. Our crises of human rights that reduce people to numbers, to demographics, which is a word that I would encourage all of us to stop using when in reference to people, unless you're counting them, and counting them is a way in which they lose their humanity. It is a way that it is a framing which contributes to people's disposability. The processes are incredibly important. That we're talking about borders that are the result of actions, that these are, as Julie said, historically contingent. They are the result of processes. But the processes are also processes of movement. Again, back to our people who are moving across these borders and being prevented from moving across these borders and living in these border zones that are limiting and defining of them. In terms of politics, of course, and we have reference to the politics, all 3 papers, we see politics taking the form of policies. We see politics taking the form of structures, sometimes quite literal structures, such as border walls and jails, but also in the forms of the exercise of power. And all of these work together to frame migration as a problem and as the source of other problems that then need to be addressed by further exercises of power and additional policies. But I want to remind all of us, and here I'm speaking as an anthropologist, that migration is a fundamental part of the human condition. It is what we do and what we have always done, and that when people in power exercise that power over others, they transform that human exercise of motion into something that is a problem that is then to be controlled by those who have access to these resources. So I want to introduce one more P word, not a very elegant way of putting it, but in addition to people, processes, and politics, I wanted to introduce the word place. Because of course, that's part of what's happening when people are occupying spaces. They make them homes, they leave homes. Those borders are defining places that include some people and exclude others. So many of these places are defined by borders, and they're also defined by our imaginings. They're defined by sometimes other people's imaginings. And those borders then get naturalized so that we forget that historical contingency. They get, these places get racialized, and that racialization, again, the result of processes, is often a projection that is the result of certain kinds of movement, sometimes voluntary, sometimes involuntary. And they get inscribed so that in certain imaginings, the United States gets imagined as a white space, and Mexico gets imagined as a brown space, and Brazil, where I work, gets imagined as a black space. But these are, of course, not just gross overgeneralizations and falsehoods, but they are also the result of movements of people, and displaced people and immigrants. And those imaginings then feed back into this process of policy and the exertion of power. So there are so many themes that I would like to pull out of these papers, and hopefully we'll continue to have conversations, but I would like to open the floor now to questions from the audience so that you can address your questions to our panelists.
Emphasizing the importance of movement as a fundamental component of the human condition. I think that's something that is a great way to frame a lot of things that we're talking about.
I think it's working. Can you hear me? Okay. I would like to thank all of you for great presentations. You know, I was trying not to cry, it's too early for that. But I have a question about the notion of dehumanization. Because I think it's connected to this notion of place and preventing people from moving. So within your own work and your research, what do you think we could do to prevent people being dehumanized, to help remind other people that you're dealing with an individual, not a number? Because whether you read articles or you watch the TV or you listen to any kind of social media, we forget. It's so easy to forget that the person in front of us is another person. So what do you think we should do to tackle this process of forgetting that someone is a human being?
I can answer. Go ahead. Thanks for your question. That is the question. How do we deconstruct all this dehumanizing language, dehumanizing policies? And it is, I think there are many levels. On a very basic level, we build relationships with people who are different from us. And I challenge you and everyone in this room to build a meaningful relationship with someone who's undocumented, and it will change your world. It is the way in which we connect to others that, in my opinion, is the essence. And if we lose that sense, I think that one of the things, and I guess I'll share, it's just kind of very personal, but that motivates me personally in this issue, is that every undocumented person that I've interacted with has got this enormous moral compass. Because to go through what you have to go through, you have in terms of like the the constant narrative about your illegality, the constant narrative about your unworthiness, about your undeservingness. And yet, to persevere and to get up in the morning and to brush your hair and put your makeup on and brush your teeth and set outside to go face the world is you have to have some type of moral compass that keeps you going. And I feel like that's what's so enriching to me in the relationships that I build, is that I can try to also hold on to that, you know, and so I think that that's where we start.
Yeah, and I could add that,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Please.
Okay. In my work as a literature scholar, it can sometimes feel very far removed from real life and the people we value who are doing this important activism work. I do see, though, that's one of the really important values of literature, art, film, theater, is that it does humanize these stories that can seem so overwhelming and distant and abstract. I'm working on translating some of Nadia Villafuerte's stories. Some of them have appeared. You can maybe find them online. I think that's one way too, is sharing these, reading the authors who are from the spaces we're talking about, hearing what they have to say and sharing it. It's a small step.
I just think education, and that's what they're talking about in both, but in my classes, just having guest speakers come, or we go somewhere where, as part of a field trip, to enjoy this experience of interacting with others on a certain issue. So I try to do that in as many classes as I can, and students always say, they have gone through a transformation as a result. Mm-hmm. So it's doing what we can to bring people together. And I know if you're not with undocumented people in your life, I think finding ways to volunteer or coming to the protest and just finding ways that you can make that happen. I think our society kind of purposely puts people in enclaves, and we don't cross paths with people that are unlike us that often. And that just perpetuates our fear of people who are not like us. And so I'm saying it can be challenging, because the way the structure of our society is set up, we're not meant to. And so we have to work hard to make that happen. So just finding those ways.
I just want to add that in considering the larger refugee crisis that we're living through right now, the work being done by Doctors Without Borders is exemplary. The way they treat people in providing them basic shelter, medicine, first aid, and food is remarkable. So I take a cue from their work as well.
Thank you so much for your papers. I appreciate that the panel opened with a discussion of literature, and I'm struck by the commentary that was just made about the importance of the arts and artistic expression. And I just want to offer some, I guess, a mixture of thoughts and questions about how artistic expression, whether that be literature or music or dance or visual art, can serve as a form of resistance, and also supportive of the kinds of capital that were discussed in the presentation, aspirational capital, linguistic capital, familial capital, etc. And also in terms of children and supporting them in education, there are many studies about the transcendent power of the arts to engage children that may otherwise feel marginalized. And I know that sometimes those studies and that literature get stuck in scholarly circles without really filtering out into the communities where they can be helpful. But the College Board, for one, did a study called Arts at the Core about maybe 10 years ago that generated all kinds of data about students who may feel the sense of alienation, how they are invited and included by virtue of being engaged in art, whether that's music or visual or otherwise. So I guess my comment / question has to do with whether what kinds of considerations are given to employing the arts both in acts of resistance and acts of support.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for your comments and questions. I agree. I feel very happy that this panel had an interdisciplinary mix that did include arts and humanities. Just to reiterate what Misha said, that human creativity and human movement are these fundamental processes that are just part of being a human. So what considerations are given to employing the arts in acts of resistance? And then the second part? Supporting children in their education. Right. So, I mean, I think that there are a few things that are coming to mind. One is obviously I'm teaching at OU, and I have a limited number of students who are in my classes reading in Spanish. So that's a limited access area. There are lots of programs through Oklahoma Humanities, for example, and Oklahoma Arts. For example, Let's Read About It Oklahoma, I think, is one program that takes books to different communities, to different libraries throughout the state, and has discussions, community discussions. But I think it's a very important challenge to all of us to connect to the community, connect K-12 and post-secondary education, which are often pitted against each other. And I know that's not a very, very specific answer, but I think it's a really important point. Your point's well taken. Does anyone else have something to say?
We should watch our time here, so yeah, let's.
Okay. Just, first of all, arts are being cut in the schools, and so this is very problematic because we're human beings that need to have that nurtured, our creativity nurtured. And so that's my challenge, is that our community incorporate arts for all children, but specifically for those who are, English is not their first language, to give an outlet for a voice and creativity. And I think that now is the time for young people to use art as acts of resistance. We're seeing young people stand up all around for different issues that have come across in the last couple months. I think it's time for the youth to take these as their weapons, art, and make themselves heard.
I think one art form in particular that I think is extremely powerful is the art of performance and performance art. You know, and just to put on your radar, Jesus Valle was just here at the Woody Guthrie Center and just gave just a fantastic, just extremely powerful, moving performance about his life living undocumented. It's called Yo Solo, and but the part I think that was really, I mean, I think that what they were trying to do, and it was very effective. It was so powerful. It moves you to action. So in other words, you are just, you know, the performance piece has a way to just lay it out, tell a real story, you know, and that, I mean, it's hard to just not do anything after you've seen that kind of thing. So I think that's a powerful medium. VALLE.
Look at all the young people out in the streets last weekend. That's encouraging. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and please engage them.